Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. We're a father-son business podcast where we talk with other lifelong learners about making an impact and solving big problems. And we got with us today Dr. Miss Doctor. I always have fun with that because, in German it's Herr Doctor. So Frau Dr. Carla Fowler.
I'm doing
How you doing,
great.
Carla?
Thanks for that, Otis. I'm gonna.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't expect to get a Deutschland introduction
Frau
today,
Doctor.
did you?
That's a great way to start introducing myself.
Oh, I love it. I think it's one of the coolest things. I had a friend of mine who was a doctor and a colonel in the German army, and he was Herr Colonel Doctor. Now that right there is a title.
It's something we can all aspire to.
Oh yeah, there you go. There you go. Well, speaking of being the doctor, you went through all this awesome education, and apparently from my research, blew it out of the water. You were that kid that I wanted to sit next to and copy off of on the tests because you did really well in school, and you went off into surgery. But then you decided, nah, I don't want to do that. I want to help people in a different way. Mm-hmm. Where did that change? Because that's a significant change to go through all that schooling and preparation, and then go, nah, that ain't working for me.
Well, it's interesting because you talk about like lifelong learning, and definitely if you're going to make that big a change in the middle, you better be committed to lifelong learning because. There are these moments where you start over and you take a new path, you take a new pivot. And, of course, when you look back and you ask, like, what were you thinking all along the way? It looks different than retrospectively, like the nice story one can tell. But I think as I was growing up and thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, one thing was definitely like, I need a job. Like you need to get out. For whatever reason, as a kid, I was like, "Oh, you need to be able to take care of yourself, and be capable at something." I also was totally a problem solver, and like math and science just made sense to me. Like there was sort of some rules that would govern it. You could kind of figure things out, and so. And then I was super socially inclined, so really interested in people. Loved thinking about like how do people work, generally speaking, like was sort of pro-social, liked people, and all of these.
Which is very anti-surgeon, by the way, at least in all my experiences with every surgeon.
This is good. You're
I've
picking up
met.
on the breadcrumbs, that I'm dropping along the way here in the opening scenes of the movie. So ultimately, I ended up heading into medicine because engineering was a little too, I don't know, I just couldn't get as excited about it as I was about solving problems for people. And so that's sort of how I found my way into medicine. But a big piece of it was, honestly, and this is what my family would say about me, they're like, Carla likes to find the most difficult thing. She'll scan the environment, figure out what that thing is, and then be like, I got to go figure out how to do that. And I think, I added up the stuff I was kind of interested in, and I was like, well, medicine, that's a really hard thing. That'll be a good challenge. and it's a good job. And so I think there was a lot that wasn't, I wasn't this uber deliberate person growing up. It was more just, I wanted something that seemed exciting, that had some challenge with it, and that felt like it was sort of a good skill set match for the kinds of stuff I felt like I was good at. And ultimately, I think I was excited to work with smart people, and I was like, okay, there's a bunch of smart people, in medicine, and so that's sort of how I ended up there. I think that's some of the stuff that I was thinking about, and then of course there's the wrinkle of a friend of mine was like, well, they have these programs where you can get a PhD and an MD, and they'll pay you. So you don't have the debt, you get paid the whole time. It takes you twice as long, well,
they didn't tell you that part, did they?
Sort of figured that out on my own, but I was like, that sounds like the best deal. You're going to get paid to learn. You're going to graduate with these degrees. I'm like pretty interested in this stuff and all the problem solving, like both the scientific problem solving and people problem solving. And so I was off to the races, and there went the decade of my 20s.
Yes, under pressure learning, but getting paid for it.
Well,
though.
and then it becomes your job. My job was to learn, and there were some really wonderful things about that period of my life. One of them was I got to play high-level sports the whole time, because the first 6 years were still sort of like being in college. I thought, for me, you had some class. When I worked in the lab, my mentor very much cared about results, but he wasn't breathing down my neck like, are you in the lab at 8 a.m.? Like, if I wanted to stay in the lab all night so I could go to an ultimate frisbee tournament, for the whole weekend, as long as I was showing up with those results, it was okay. And then I think the other great things were, it was a way in which pretty early in your career, I got to do some stuff that felt like it really, really mattered. Like I got to work on a scientific problem and produce some scientific discovery that like really mattered to the field of cancer research. And on the medicine side, as you're a med student and you're moving into residency, you're still pretty young, but you're talking with people about decision making, about things that are pretty high stakes for them. And I think one of the interesting things is, for many of us early in our careers, and this isn't true of everything, I think there's some great parallels in the military, for example, where you can be pretty young and obviously working on stuff that matters a lot, that is intense, that requires really rigorous decision making. So I think there was a lot about it that actually was totally in line with the kind of stuff that I wanted. And so, that's like, part one of the story. Things are great until they're not. So that's like part one.
Well, what was there an incident? I mean, can you pinpoint it? It was like,
or
I talked to
or
this
more
dude,
so, because Dad, you already referenced this as as a surgeon,
again,
not getting to talk too much. And I know that's a problem in the last 15 years of the medical field, that you're talking to patients less and less and less. Was it the lack of talking, or which end of the spectrum was it?
Oh, you guys are pinpointing all the right things. Well, the thing is, it was more.
We're softball. We play softball here on the Cam and Otis show.
It was more of a slow boil, and I bring it up because I think for a lot of us, life and the decision making we make about our careers and other big life stuff often doesn't take place because there's one very clear incident where we just go from X to Y. And I bring that up because I have a lot of empathy, both in the coaching that I do and also, just for people in general. When we think about what we want in life and our performance, it's often not as clear as that. And so if people out there listening are feeling that way, I'm like, don't worry. That's usually how life occurs. Kind of this slow boil of something's not quite right here. And so for me, I think the graduation into a general surgery residency, and I got to pick where I wanted to go. I was at my top choice and heading down that pathway. And I think the biggest thing that really shifted was just the amount of time flexibility that I had to, as long as I could, as long as I could manage my time effectively, I could play high-level sports, I could, do my scholastics and have some life outside of that. And with surgery, it was definitely one of those things where, as a resident, but also as I looked at the attendings, you get one thing. So you really are really there for 80 hours a week. And actually, unofficially, usually more than that. The time outside the hospital was 8 hours a day, and you had to sleep. If I wanted to see my fiance, if I wanted to exercise, all that had to fit in the time outside of there. And, you also talked about some of the real pressures that are on the healthcare system, and not just for surgeons, but really across the board, I think I was looking ahead at the attendings and realizing that like that stuff wasn't going away. And some of the things that I liked the most about what I thought it would be to be a high-performing doctor were those human elements, you know, like, do you stop by and check on someone at the end of the day, even though like I'm supposed to be getting my butt out of the hospital, but they're kind of in a quiescent phase, and so they haven't gotten much doctor attention, but maybe they're older, and like it's rough being in the hospital on having nobody around, even if you're doing fine. It's just rough, you know. And I was the person who would go by and be like, "No, I just gotta check in and talk to them a little bit." And at the same time, the system is so pressured that like you sort of can't do that and survive. There's just too much work and not quite enough time. And so you start to see these things and say, oh, okay, well, you know, does that still work? Is this still the thing? That is how I want to spend that many hours. And now is a good time to make a decision, because residency is where you really put in your time. And so it was sort of that slow boil over that year of residency that led to the saying, you know what, I know it's not this, and I know what I like, and I know what my capabilities are, but I need to find a new way to put them together. So that was it. Not a single moment, but it's like those things when you look and you're like, I can't bully this reality. Like, this is what it is to be a surgeon. And we really need people who that is their dream. But like, if it's not your dream, you got to open that up for someone else.
Before we shift entirely into that next chapter that you hinted at, great storytelling, by the way, Carla, you're killing it on that. But the thing I'm interested in, because you don't strike me as the type of person to just kind of throw up your hands and leave the problem. So even if you haven't, you know, gone back and fixed that problem at every hospital, I'm sure you've thought about it. What are some ideas you have as far as fixing that problem of the overworking, the lack of socialization, all those kind of things?
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot, and some of how I think about it is, everyone we know interacts with the healthcare system, and so to some degree, some of it is it's a pretty regulated system. There are a lot of layers of like policy and change that would need to shift to make the dynamics different. But one of the ways I think about it is, how do you help people interact with the medical system in a good way? Like acknowledging that doctors are humans too. They're working real hard. When they don't have a lot of time or they seem hurried, there's actually some really good reasons for that. And so some of it is we can solve the problem from both sides with a little bit of empathy or understanding. I think the other part of it is, so obviously what I pivoted towards was actually building an executive coaching practice that really, you could argue it's not a medical practice, but it is behavioral, and that really I use performance science to help leaders in all different industries figure out how they can level up what they're doing and their results. And so certainly there are a number of ways in which I talk to whether it's a doctor who wants to pivot or people who are working on health innovations to kind of improve how things are happening. So there's ways I still absolutely interact with that and say
the other way I'd like to ask that before we shift on to the next area is, if you think of it, I always like to think of like magic wand solutions is what I call them, of just like, okay, hey, it'd be impossible to change all those systems, but if you could just wave the wand and change one thing, what do you think would have the most effect?
Well, one thing that was a really powerful experience for me while I was a med student and also while I was a resident was I worked with a number of different mid-level providers. And what I mean when I say that is nurses, physician's assistants, nurse practitioners. And these were all individuals, so they do not have an MD, but were participating with providing a ton of the care for patients in hospitals. And the most phenomenal teams that I worked with, like one of the teams I worked with was the transplant surgery team. at Stanford as we were rotating through all the different specialties. And that team was phenomenal in their ability to share the workload. And part of it was because they weren't sort of saying, okay, well, the doctors can do this stuff and everyone else is going to be kind of admin, but they can't do any of the care. Or we're going to give kind of minimal responsibility. And this requires both a cultural shift in medicine, which has often been kind of like the doctors are in charge and act like it. Not all. But I learned more across the teams from some of these mid-level providers, very expert, very good at patient care. And I learned so much from them as a resident. And I also saw that the teams functioned really well when they were willing to share that autonomy and responsibility. And so one of the things I've often thought, and this is not an original thought to me, is that the more we could say, how do we share the load in medicine and share out that responsibility and it's not that we shouldn't have regulation. People should be expert at their role, and we should have some clarity about, what can you do at a given level of education. But I think we need to be a little more open-minded about it. And that takes a big cultural shift as well. But that would be my magic wand, is kind of having it be less like doctors deliver the care. That is what happens. And that requires a shift in the brains of the public as well, to say, because sometimes people walk in and they say, I want to see a doctor. And the doctor is a nurse practitioner who can help them and provide exactly what they need. But sometimes people have attitudes about what that means.
Yeah, that would be a huge cultural shift, but there's a lot of value to that. And you think about how many different organizations, business, military, function that way. A hierarchy. It's a hierarchy system. Military is an excellent example of that. But the best functioning teams, that leader is also willing to pick up the shovel and dig the foxhole with the soldier. It's not sitting there waiting for somebody to dig it for him, like portrayed in some World War I movies, where the leader is back in the rear just sipping coffee. That doesn't work. But that's really the makeup of a surgical team and that doctor team in a hospital, and I can vouch for that, because I've had. I probably will again. But a lot of experience dealing with surgeons and surgical teams, right? And I know that they're not teams. They're individuals who fill a role, and they don't look at it as teamwork. And it's kind of sad that something so simple could change the outlook of healthcare so easily. But I've also got to put a stomp on Camden saying, before we switch, because I'm not ready to switch on that. Because if you said something, and you said it several times, and I'm sorry, but I cannot help but think about the frog in the boiling pot. Because, you
got to make sure you cough and give us a time to process that phrase, which I don't think Carla or I recognized.
But it's landing now. Okay, I'm with you.
All right.
Oh, you're on mute, Dad. The cough button got you.
All right, dang gummit, my cough button was still on. I should have coughed while it was still on. Here's the deal. You take a frog and you drop him in a pot of boiling water, he's going to jump out. You put the frog in a pot of water and you put it on the stove and you turn it up, and that's a slow boil. And the metaphor is that as the environment takes over if you're not aware. And the frog in the water that's simmering to boiling is not aware, is not consciously aware of the environment, because he could just as easily jump out of the pot like he does if you drop him in a pot when it's already boiling. It's like, dang, that's hot, putting your finger in it, right? So because you said slow boil, a couple of times, and how that happened. It just made me.
It's a country ass phrase, and it's okay. But
non-famous of a metaphor. My generation. Well, I must have boiled a few more frogs than y'all did growing up. Let's just say. But when you think about that decision, again, because the frog is not aware, it's not consciously aware of the environmental change that is about to kill him. You were environmentally aware and got the hell out the pot.
Good point and description. Yeah. So, actually, sorry, I stopped. What did you have a question? I can totally speak to that, but I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, yeah, speak to it, because that's a lesson that I think everybody needs to hear, because I see it in folks that are friends, folks that could be clients, but they're not.
Yes.
They're not willing to get out of the pot, and they're allowing themselves to get fried up, to get cooked in that boiling water and suffer through that situation.
It was definitely hard to get out of the pot. It was hard, but it was clear. And so I think your point about, and I think it's often hard to get out of the pot. And so often what I focus on with clients is not or friends, like family, anyone you encounter, is less about how hard is it and more about how clear is it. And so I think, and to be fair, I think I have been a person who had a lot of grit. So actually I have a lot of examples of where I stayed in the boiling water for a while, but got out before it killed me. Yeah, but I definitely was a person who would really kind of stick with things. I would say, I played for a couple of different ultimate frisbee teams over the time that I played, and we played pretty competitively. So we won national championships. It was ultimate frisbee is kind of laughable on some fronts, but but we played it very seriously. And I played with one team, and I think honestly, the dynamics of the team weren't as good as they could be. I've always been a person pretty sensitive to what are the dynamics. It's good to compete, but there's also a sense of when everyone is pulling in the same direction versus we're all kind of operating together, but not as well as we could be. And sometimes you stay on a team longer than maybe you should before you get off. But so, because you sort of think you can improve something. And to some degree, I like this analogy of the frog that stays in the water for a while, because I've always had the perspective of I can change something. I'm an agent, and I want to improve not just myself. So sometimes we need to make a change in ourselves. Sometimes we need to make a change in our environment. We can improve the team dynamics. How can we impact beyond ourselves? And to some degree, if people get out of the water the moment it gets warm at all, often you don't end up doing very much. Because a lot of the big stuff you want to go do, it's hard to tell if you're in a pot of water that's going to start boiling, or if you're in a hot tub and you're headed somewhere good, but it's got some challenge associated with it. I'm kind of stretching the analogy here. But
you stay in a hot tub too long, you're going to mess yourself up.
But I think you get the point, which is, when you're going to do something really impactful, if you start a startup, or there are going to be moments where the water feels hot. So our jobs sometimes is to say, man, if we split and run, the moment something gets a little uncomfortable, we're gonna have to pick something pretty mundane to spend our life doing. And that's actually not very good for us as human beings. Stagnation, I think, is one of the worst things for us. On the other hand, if you stay too long in a situation that's a bad fit for you, or that's even just toxic, let's say, you get boiled, you get cooked. And so I think I like this analogy though, because it helps us look at what is the stuff of life and challenge. And this is something I love to talk about with clients, because we have to understand the nature of the games we're playing, or we'll spend a lot of time thinking something's wrong here. It's either not exciting enough, or it's way too exciting. When usually it's like...
Do you think this episode of the Cam and Otis Show, if you're enjoying this conversation, then make sure to share it with other lifelong learners in your life so they can enjoy it too. Stay up to date with the show on Facebook and Instagram at Cam and Otis Show, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you're the first to hear about new episodes and other special content. Now let's get back to the show. Something that is necessarily needs to be cyclical in nature. I had this conversation with a friend recently because with my demographic, and for me specifically, I am about going on 5 now, but about 4 years out from when I graduated college, and college is about 4 years, and high school is about 4 years. And I started thinking kind of in those chapters like that. And it's like, okay, hey, every 4 years you got to make this change. Every 4 years this, or like, that's your growth period, and then you make this big change and all that kind of stuff. Do you think there's any truth to it needing to be cyclical, whether it's 4 years or whatever, or do you think it's the system we should strive for is more continuous in nature?
I think they're both examples of different ways you can do things, and people have different styles. So I'll give an example. I have some clients who really have identified themselves as like builders, and so when I say that, it's like they like to come in, build a new project, like solve a new problem, or really build and launch something. But then they're like, maintenance kills me. Like growing and improving something after it's been creative, like I just go to sleep, like snooze. And that's how they are. And I know other people who are phenomenal at saying, hey, I don't know that I identify as like the visionary, like the 0 to 1 person, but if you give me something with some structure, they know how to nurture it. They know how to grow it to make it scalable. They know how to bring in the people who it's really like fires them up to be working on this thing and create that really sustainable team dynamic. And that's their superpower, and they love it. So what I would say is, for people who really like to build, sometimes there's a more cyclical nature makes sense to say, I know when I get to about 3 to 5 years, like it's time to think, or to continually be saying, hey, I'm starting to get to that point where I might want to look for something different or the next challenge. But I have sort of a tool or a way that I talk to people who are a little more in that, like, no, I don't necessarily need to be shifting every 5 years. And yet it's still important for those folks to not kind of stagnate. And so one of the ways I visualize this is to say you have like a pyramid, like a triangle. And you can accomplish this through different ways. But the bottom part of that, like the foundation of that triangle, is it's like the stuff you can do with your eyes closed. You're so good at it. You've been doing it for so long, hands behind your back. You can just get it done. And then I would say usually that's no more than 30%. And then you've got like this middle piece of the triangle. And often it's good to say, what is the stuff that I'm striving on? And by striving, I mean, it's not totally uncertain. It's stuff you know how to do, but you have to work at it. So it's something that you really have to put some intention towards, and you got to bring it, like, to kind of accomplish that stuff. And then I like to think of the top of the pyramid, which usually shouldn't be more than 30%. Some people have a higher tolerance for uncertainty, but less than 30% is usually good. And that's your edge. That is the stuff that's super uncertain, that maybe even feels a little risky. It's stuff you're not good at. Maybe you're trying to learn it and get good at it, or it's like the experiment you really want to run just to see. And it's the stuff that takes you well out of your comfort zone. And so one of the ways I talk to people, even if they're staying at a particular place, is to say, can we think about what sorts of things fall in each of these categories for you? And often, particularly like mid-career, when people have gotten really good at what they do, sometimes that top of the pyramid is the piece that's missing. And often the idea of starting something new and becoming and being a beginner at something actually makes them a little uncomfortable, and that's okay. but it's a great moment to say, let's regain that muscle memory so that you have something that's kind of pulling out the next level from you, that's making life kind of uncertain and exciting. So to answer your question, Cam, it can look like a lot of different things, but you hit on the most important thing, which is I do think we need some growth and change. And that can look different ways.
So which one are you? Are you a builder or maintainer?
Yeah.
Heal thyself, doctor.
I would say that I'm probably 60-30, like maintainer. So I love to optimize things. And obviously, like in landing upon coaching, I had to build this practice, and that was uncomfortable. Like I learned and had a lot of transferable skills into coaching, but obviously you have to run a business, and they do not talk to you about running a business in medical school. And my husband was like, you do not need to go back and get an MBA. He's like, you have enough education.
I like your husband a lot.
I did my own MBA. Obviously, like I read books, like I, listened to podcasts, really thought about the elements of what it takes to build a business. So I did my own educating. So that was building. But certainly I think, and now I've been doing this for 10 years, so I don't see myself as someone who necessarily needs that change or that like cyclical shift. That being said, that top of the triangle becomes really important for me because I continue to coach, but there have to be things that are new that stretch me, where I have to learn a new skill, where I have to kind of get out of my comfort zone, like speaking on podcasts. So there's that. I think that's...
You had kind of mentioned the... They don't do math. They don't do math at doctor school.
Hold on. You said you were good at math.
Yeah.
Yeah, but she said she was good at it.
Oh,
60-30.
I leave
What's the
that
other 10%?
for, that's set aside to, sort of delay judgment.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe, because here's the thing. As I get further and further from being in a system that really has those like railroad tracks. So medicine is totally like, they're up a steep mountain. You got to keep up. But there's tracks, they sort of help you go along the path. Once you get out into business, you get to define your own path. And that is often when we're learning something, we don't enjoy it quite as much as when we feel like we have a little more facility with it. So I think I'm reserving judgment. Maybe I'm ultimately 60-40, but maybe I'm 70-30. So that's what that last 10% is for. Yes.
Keeping your options open, right? Well, you reminded me of a philosophy that not many people talk about. It's a Japanese philosophy called ikigai. When you're talking about that top of the pyramid and what you can do and those sort of things, and just so everybody out there knows, because not a lot of people hear that term, but ikigai, it is a Venn diagram, and there's 4 circles. Circle number 1 is what are you good at? Circle number 2 is what do you love to do? Because sometimes those two ain't the same. What's the world need is circle number 3, and then what will folks pay you for? And where those 4 circles intersect, that's your ikigai. And that's what, when you were describing the pyramid, I was thinking Venn diagram. Maybe that's the difference between being a surgeon and an engineer. I don't know, but I was going full on Venn diagram instead of pyramid. But that's what it reminded me of.
It's a wonderful model and philosophy, and actually, I mean, in now thinking about it, describes a lot of like my process of thinking about what happened after leaving surgery, right? So, on one hand, I've got a bunch of specific skills. I can sew you up. If you get cut, I can sew you up. Yes, and I know how to run a good experiment. And But as I started to think about what did I want to do, actually all of those questions, what do you love? What are you good at? What does the world need? And what will they pay you for? We're all satisfied by this answer. And it isn't like I went directly there. I had to do a bunch of loops. You have to think about it a lot. And but ultimately, we're really satisfied by this answer of saying, build your own practice. Like, it's not quite a practice in psychology. In the sense of like it's outside of the medical industry, and so you have more freedom to design and think about what you want your process to be. How do you want that to be informed? But I think when I looked at the question of, what do I love? I've always had this desire to help people, like to be of service. And also, I've always loved high performance. So I think from the time I was in 5th grade, I wanted to like do challenging things, but I also wanted to do them very well. And so I was constantly looking around to see, how do people do that? Like, what's that person's strategy? What are they doing? Why are they so good at that? We have this joke in our family that I like sat down to lunch one day and started explaining to my husband why the leftover takeout that we were eating was high performing. So it was really good takeout. And but those were the things that I had kind of sort of infinite like interest and desire to do. And then I think the other thing was I'd spent a lot of time in high performing environments where I had to come up the curve to get there. So I played multiple sports over the course of life. Like I had to do the science piece, but also the medical piece. And so when you say like, what are you good at? I think there were a lot of elements of saying, I am good at understanding the process of like in a given, whether it's an industry or a thing, how does one run a process to figure out what matters to get to the top or to be successful at the thing. And I think the other piece was just understanding that medicine had trained me to really interview people and talk to people and really be able to have hard conversations in a way that made people comfortable and helped them move forwards. So there were a number of these things that really said, hey, like a coaching practice could be a really good bet. Now, it was a bet. Now, 10 years later, I can say, I think the bet paid.
One of those other areas that you just mentioned that you have that interest in, of psychology, I kind of want to shift into there a little bit of, as you were talking about, your journey into the medical field and into surgery and that, what came to mind a lot is the value of your own labor and what you value yourself at, and how people kind of self-select into really the big 3 jobs with that. It's like you go into finance, you become a doctor, you become a lawyer, because that's where you can get the return on your investment of all of your knowledge and those type of things. I think doctors, you do have that advantage of it's like you also get to help the people. You could probably make that case for any of those directions. But I think there's a really interesting thing there of that self-selection. If you're not necessarily getting the people who are, like you were saying about yourself, who aren't necessarily the most connected to that piece. So what I want to ask is, how do you think we can change that to a way that people are self-selecting, not just on that value, but of seeing a little bit more of what is the world actually like, what is that job actually like, and getting a little bit more of that connection?
I think there are some things that are fairly well set up as is. I might just have failed.
Fair enough.
So full disclosure, I think, and there's a good reason for it, but for me, I often was a sort of take it as it comes. Not thinking too far ahead. But the other thing was I always wanted to be doing a lot of different stuff. And so for me, what that meant, for example, was like in my first year of med school, by the time winter quarter rolled around, I realized that I didn't have time to go to class and read the syllabus, because I often learned best by reading, and do the other stuff I wanted to do, sports, social, these other things. And so I stopped going to class. So I just read the syllabus. Yeah. I studied really hard, but it wasn't enough of a value add to me that I was like, this is what's most important for the things I want. This is how I'm going to manage it. Now, I think there were other people who were a lot more diligent about kind of looking ahead and saying, I want to get as many experiences as I can to really understand this. And they were really focused on medicine. And I think, my reflections looking back are like, I've always been a really kind of multi-channel person. That's what brightens me up. It's what I love. I mean, we were just talking about before the show, like the amazing powder day we had at Targhee, and all I wanted to do was just go ski the POW. And I think that's always been true for me. So what I would say in the system is that it is set up to try and give us, as doctors in training, experiences to show what it is. One of the challenges is what medicine has been changing. So, for example, if some people go into medicine because they had, a family friend or, one of their parents was a doctor, what it looked like when they were a doctor, it looks different now. The field's changing. So that's one of the things. And I think the other piece is that having dialogue, and we have more social media channels for this dialogue to happen now. Like Doximity is an interesting platform that really puts out both a bunch of good medical articles for continued learning, but also a lot of op-eds about doctors' perspectives. So I think we have more channels now for people to voice what is this career path? Like, what does it mean? The people who choose it, what is it that really works for them?
I think there's a couple of things that I kind of want to connect there. I think there's this interesting thing that it's really, you talk about like a brain drain usually on like the international level with countries and those type of things.